So good morning. My name is Michelle Herridge. I am with the Academy for Teaching and Learning. Let's see if we can minimize this out of our PowerPoint slide. So today I'm going to be talking about how to write a teaching philosophy statement and a DEI statement. I'm going to tell you exactly what those things are here in a second. But I really wanted to start with why do we even bother on this? I did a very quick search for tenure track positions at universities. One of them said, you have to have a CV, a cover letter, a statement of teaching philosophy, and then a separate statement of equity, diversity, and inclusion that includes a commitment to teaching a diverse student body. I believe that this was at Texas A&M. And that's all of the information they gave you. Here are the materials, please include these in your application. So we're going to talk about, what exactly a teaching philosophy is, and when it says a separate statement, what that implies about, sometimes you will write a teaching philosophy that has those ideas embedded, and sometimes it will be separate. Another job posting had something very similar. It has CV and cover letter, but there's a little bit more information in your teaching philosophy. Evidence of effective instruction in your area of expertise, if possible. If you've been a teacher of record, you hopefully have student responses, you have, end of course evaluations, you have feedback in some way, maybe you've been observed. That's what you should talk about in this application that's included here. There's a research statement, which I think is also important to think about in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'll also put a J on the end for justice. So you'll see some amalgam of diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and belonging. Those are sort of the 5 key words these days. Sometimes they're JEDI, sometimes it's DEI, sometimes it's DEJ, some combination of those letters. And then last but not least, this describing the experience with diverse groups of students. So let's talk specifically about the teaching philosophy statements. When you get into a classroom, when you are interacting with students, your teaching philosophy is telling the selection committee what you believe should be happening in that classroom. That's the philosophy part. What do you want to happen in your classroom? What do you want the experience to be like? What do you want students to walk away with? How do you measure that those things are happening? And really at the core of all of this is, why are you applying to a teaching position? Why are you trying to be at a university? Why do you want to have a position that includes some kind of teaching role and not just, I want to work in a lab all day, or I want to do research? Why be at a university? Why be in academia? Some things that might help with this, if you are currently teaching in particular, if you have any of those records, keep track of them. So think about what materials you're generating as a professor or a teacher of record. How do you enact your teaching beliefs? Because it's really great to say, I want to go in and inspire my students and I want my students to be successful. Very, very generic. And how do you really test or trust those things? If you say, I would like to inspire my students, and I do this by contextualizing my work or my ideas in the classroom, asking students to engage and bring their outside ideas into the classroom, then you have very specific ways of enacting the practices and enacting your teaching beliefs. It's also important to consider your teaching practices. I think that, we've all been students, and we may or may not be instructors, but as we go through our learning experiences as students, we really have a great, variety of teaching practices. Do you have a teacher that stands out in your mind as, there's one person that I want to be like, that person, made me who I am today. I want to be a chemist because my high school chemistry teacher made it seem exciting and fun and engaging, and that's why I'm a chemist. Or is it, took that organic chemistry class and that professor was terrible and I don't want to do that. And thinking about how you think about learning and how you then change your teaching practices to create those experiences for your students. This also happens with change. If you try something in the classroom and it doesn't work, that's great. That's something that you should be doing. That's scholarship. We, do research, we try new things, we explore questions. And in the classroom, you should also be trying new things. And if you've been doing that in your classroom, keep track of it. Let it show up in your philosophy, because it shows that you're willing to try new things. It says that, I'm willing to engage with evidence-based practices, or there's new research on learning and cognition that says we should not rely on rote memorization, or we should do more project-based learning, or whatever it might be. If you're open to change and you talk about changes that you've done in the past and have evidence of those things, it can make a much stronger teaching statement. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions.
I mean, it's just me.
Yeah.
When you mentioned including you have student feedback and things as evidence, and that's probably really the only evidence you can have of whatever you may be wishing to show about the classes you teach. What part of it do you include? I mean, what's the most impactful part of those? Okay, now that I've thought about it for a second, as a person who hasn't looked at a ton of these, the feedback data that you get, which is kind of just a pile of statistics, what is the most meaningful part of that for evaluation purposes?
I think that it's important that if you say, in my classroom, I expect students to feel comfortable asking questions. And then you get feedback and you keep an eye out for your feedback, and either in the written comments or depending on how your department does your evaluations. I felt great asking questions, very comfortable coming to office hours, very accessible, communicated clearly. So there's evidence in very okay, we have these statistics, which I'm not going to go down the path of TCEs right now, but there's valuable information in the comments that your students give you. There's value in asking your student. You should be asking your students throughout your teaching practices, hey, are we doing okay? Are we, engaging in formative assessment in the classroom is a huge part of evidence-based practices, to check in and engage with your students and get feedback from your students. Because if you're standing in front of your classroom just talking at students and then give them an exam and they all vomit, you have no idea why that's happening. So I really recommend, if you want to talk about these, if you want to have evidence, put a 1 point extra credit question on your exam that says, tell me one thing that went really well in this unit. Tell me one thing that didn't go so well in this unit. And then you've got throughout the semester, and it's not just at the end of the semester trying to think back to the first unit and saying, oh man, there was so much jargon the first week, I don't even know what's happening. And so you get those aspects and you have evidence in that way to include. And I think it's important to consider when you're keeping track of your evidence that you're tying it explicitly to your objectives. I use evidence-based practices in active learning in my classroom. So I make a point of looking for those types of comments or seeking out that type of feedback from my students. Hopefully that makes sense. Is there a question in the chat?
No, I was letting Sifan know that he could either drop questions in the chat or have anything to ask.
Yes, I do have a question.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Like some positions, they do ask only for teaching, like the position might be only teaching. Like you also suggested, some positions are blended with research and teaching. When you have a cover letter statement of research and a statement of teaching philosophy, if you have experience in teaching, for example, I had 3 years of teaching in another university, I kind of have problem like separating some of the experiences which I try to write in those different documents, like cover letter, statement of research, and then a statement of teaching philosophy. So how do you solve these kind of issues, problems?
So if I understand your question correctly, it's how do you differentiate what's in your cover letter versus your teaching statement versus a DEI statement? Is that right?
Yes.
So my good rule of thumb is that each document should be as short as possible. So if you're getting overlap, it means that you can cut. So in your my cover letter is strictly 2 pages. Who I am, here's my research, here's my teaching experience, here's my goals, 1 paragraph on each one of those things, and sort of a like direct tie into the mission statement of where I'm applying to. That's your cover letter. In my teaching philosophy is a maximum of 2 pages. If it's a combination research and teaching, then I do 3 pages. But I don't know if you can see this. This is my teaching philosophy. It's 2 pages, it's 1 3/4. And it's very much focused on, here is what I want my classroom environment to look like. Here is how I will engage in assessment. So these were supposed to all come up together, but that's fine. So these are the first group of sort of ideas to keep in mind. Keep it brief, use first person, make it specific, talk about what you teach. And not just in general, I like teaching, but I like teaching introductory level general chemistry courses because I enjoy working with 18-year-olds who are still figuring out what they want to do in their life and why they need to take science classes. And they bring a sense of inquiry and excitement to the classroom that you don't usually find with upperclassmen. Maybe you love teaching upperclassmen because they know what they're doing, they're motivated, you don't have to handhold them, you can just say, here are your assignments, and they take on more responsibility. So this is all in your teaching philosophy. You can and should allude to or explicitly include things about your diversity, equity, and inclusion in your teaching philosophy, because like I do activities in my classroom in active-based learning. So active-based learning means that I expect students to engage in group work and work on things in class. If I don't also set up my classroom environment to be inclusive and to address microaggressions and to encourage group work and encourage questions and those types of things, then I'm not going to be successful in my active-based learning. So thinking about, what do I want my teaching to look like and what are my goals? How does the DEI statement support those goals? And in the cover letter, very briefly say, these evidence-based practices, here's the age range that I like to teach. Does that answer your question? Feel like that?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so here's my like cheat sheet for your teaching philosophy statements. Keep it brief. As I said, there's no part of my packet that is more than 2 pages except for my CV. But I have a short CV and a long CV. I have a 2-pager and I have like my full everything. One of the things that I think is super important to consider is to be sincere. I think that is, we get really good at, here's the buzzword, or here's what I think you want me to say. I think that it translates very apparently on the page of, oh, here's my laundry list of things I want you to say. And then you start talking to somebody and they're like, oh yeah, I just like, there's either not an understanding of what those terms mean, or just trying to hit the buzzwords rather than communicating that you have truly deeply thought about what you want your classroom experience to be like for your students. The be humble is always an odd one up here of, we are scholars and researchers, and that comes into the classroom. Like, people who've been teaching for 50 years can still learn more about teaching. We should not be like, this is the end of the, like, my way or the highway, this is the end all be all, or else I would be out of a job. But it's really important to recognize that there is a lot of different ways to teach. There's a lot of different ways to be successful in teaching and for your students to engage in that. And review and revise and review and revise. I have 1,000 copies. And I think that it's also one of the best review and revise techniques I've ever had is to write something, put away, don't look at it for a week, start from scratch, write it again. Because it's a philosophy, if it's your truly deep-seated, deeply held beliefs, it'll show up again. If it doesn't show up again, you're probably not actually targeting what you believe happens in the classroom. You're just thinking about all of the things that should be in the classroom. But when things start happening, like when you start writing and, you know, every time I write this philosophy, I say equity-centered, probably means that equity is important to me and I'm going to engage in equity-centered practices in my classroom. Some other things to include: your definition of good teaching. Is your definition of good teaching to have the textbook memorized or to be able to elicit responses from students? Methods that make that good teaching possible. If you want engagement in your classroom, how do you do that? Do you cold call? Do you assign groups? Do you pick names out of a hat? Do you use, you know, technologies like Socrative or Kahoot or Poll Everywhere, whatever? There's hundreds of them now. We live in an incredible technology period where we can do a lot of really cool things in the classroom. But if you're not matching the methods that you're using to your goals, your philosophies, and your definitions, then it looks like you're not doing your homework. Goals for yourself and for your students. Do you want someone to leave your classroom passing a standardized exam for your accreditation, excited to be in your major, changing their major to your department, just being able to function as adults in the world? And it's going to be variable based on what class you're teaching. So some of this is going to be really important, that when you read the job description, to say, this position is looking for introductory level courses. This is looking for graduate level courses. This is looking for a mix. Here are the goals at any level, broadly or more specifically. And then goals for yourself. I want to engage in professional development. I want to find the Center for Teaching and Learning like Baylor's ATL. I want to read the discipline-based education journals and bring evidence-based practices into my classrooms. I want to establish and maintain course evaluations that are, you know, high, good. You can pick some metric. It's hard to pick some of those metrics until you've been at the institution, but saying I am going to collect feedback from my students, I'm going to consider it and make changes, is a goal that you can have for yourself, and it's not just about your students. What kinds of students you've worked with and their desired outcomes. If you only ever taught freshman level general chemistry, which is what I did as a grad student, then that's what you can speak about. And you can say, you know, here's what I've done. This has shaped how I would like to go forward, whether, you know, this was a great experience and I want to continue working with that population, or this is a great experience, but I want to work with somebody else. There's really important to establish what you would like to do, but also what you've done. And then evaluation and assessment methods. So I could probably talk for a whole year on evaluation and assessment. That's what my doctoral work was on. But thinking about, how are you going to evaluate student outcomes? If there's a standardized test, is it Is that the only assessment? Are you going to have high stakes and low stakes assessments? Are you going to grade homework? Are you going to grade attendance? Are you going to do formative assessment that is daily or weekly or just homework? What does it look like for you to understand what your students know? Because at the end of the day, we expect our students to get something out of our classrooms, right? It's great that, you know, they're paying all of this money to attend our classes, but we ask them to come to our classes for a reason. What is that reason? How are you going to measure and evaluate whether or not that reason is being achieved?
Can I ask you a question?
Mhm.
This is kind of follow up to what I asked earlier, but in terms of including elements of the evidence in the teaching philosophy statement, do you use quotes? You know, how do you actually include that?
I have used quotes. I have included, I have specifically asked my references to include things like that. And because my references have always observed me at some point, I say, can you speak to whether or not I engage in these practices? I think letters of recommendation are really powerful in that aspect. I do use quotes. I get really personal in my teaching statement. I have them here. I'm happy to share them. But I do, you know, I expect this level of engagement, and then say, and students have commented that they appreciate this. There is some level of, you have to trust me that the evidence exists. But if you have that evidence and can speak to it, then I think that goes a long way. Of, you know, you're going to be confident when you see those things, and not, it's part of the sincerity piece. I'm going to read the first 3 sentences of my teaching statements. By the time students reach a university classroom, they have experienced many different ideas and have some idea of what they might want to do in the world. If they've made it to my classroom, a chemistry classroom, chances are good they're interested in science or medicine. What I hope my students gain from my class is critical thinking skills, reasoning abilities, and resource management. And then I go on. I really enjoy working with freshmen and sophomores. I haven't been a teacher of record, but I have done all of these other leadership things. But I start off with, you know, good argumentation skills. Here, like setting the stage. They're in a science classroom. Here's what I expect them to get. Here's how I'm going to help them achieve these goals. And then I also talk about, here's formative assessment. Here's what I do as research. Here's, you know, I have lots of ideas that I've never gotten to do. Here's one example of those things to say to increase engagement. Engagement clearly is super important to me. But it's important. I think the first part of a teaching philosophy is to sit down and really take the time to reflect on what you expect out of your classroom. Do you want to just stand up there and lecture and assign questions out of the book? That's a teaching philosophy. Use the materials provided to me. Follow the directions. Work cohesively in the department to meet departmental expectations. But taking the time to think about, why do I do the things that I do, and why do I want to do the things that I do? Good questions. Other questions? Jumping to DEI-J statements. So diversity is the representation of different and unique identities, characteristics, experiences, and perspectives. I would like to put a giant asterisk next to this. Diverse, an individual cannot be diverse. A group of people is diverse. So when we talk about diversity, I meet the needs of a variety of students in my classroom. I, as a woman, am not diverse. I'm only one person, but I can contribute to diversity in a department and become a model that showcases the abilities of women or whatever it might be. Equity is giving everyone what they need to succeed. So it's not that everyone gets everything equally. It's that meeting people where they need help. There's a great figure that I sometimes use. Giving everyone the same bicycle is going to fit most of the population, but if you are a small child, you need a toddler-sized bike. If you are of limited mobility, maybe you need a bicycle that you move with your arms rather than your legs. So equity is making it so that everyone can ride a bike, not giving everyone the same bicycle. Inclusion means that you're having a welcoming culture. Everyone is valued, respected, and able to reach their full potential. So, inclusion has a lot to do with microaggressions, making sure that if there are comments or otherwise derogatory remarks made in the classroom, as the instructor, you are stopping that you are modeling good behavior for your students, that you're not shutting anyone down or engaging in deficit perspectives, which we'll talk about deficit perspectives in a couple of slides. And then this last piece is justice, which is the newest edition. It's the idea that it's not the individual, but it's the organization or the system that promotes or inhibits equality and equity in different spaces. Okay? There are lots of different types of justice, but it addresses the cultural norms within a department or within an institution, rather than saying, in my individual experience. So your classroom can generate open the door for more justice in a department or in an institution. I will just plug this here. If you're around in the fall, we're going to be doing a faculty interest group that is going to be STEM specific. So it'll be evidence-based practices and discipline-based education research in STEM for addressing DEI and evidence-based practices in the STEM classrooms. Postdocs are more than welcome to join that. Even if you're not currently teaching, I think it would be a lot. It has traditionally generated a lot of really good discussion, and it's good to know, what the resources are out there as far as the research on these types of things. And that's my plug. So keep an eye out. It's going to be called the FIG, the Faculty Interest Group. All right. So the questions that are addressed in your DEI statements: what does DEIJ mean to you? How do you prioritize and value DEIJ in your teaching? What ways are DEIJ apparent in your research or scholarly work? So this is why I included the request for a research statement in the application materials. You can say in your research statement, and you should include, I want to mentor graduate students, or I want to mentor undergraduate students. I will select people to work in my group based on their interest and future goals, and I will try to create a welcoming space that is inclusive and equitable for anyone who's interested in joining my group. So while we normally think about DEIJ in terms of the teaching classroom, it also speaks to your research group. It also speaks to the people that you surround yourself in those research spaces. And then how do you show your commitment? Do you engage in things like cold calling or calling names from a hat, which has been shown to limit any sort of biases. If you're pulling names out of a hat, you can't call on the same two people every class period, and you're not just taking volunteers, because we know, hopefully we all know that the people who volunteer tend to be a specific demographic, or it's the same 3 people every class of 300. So if you vary those things, if you bring in learning assistants, if you bring in different classroom structures, you can address some of these DEI and equity pieces and rely on the literature for this. So things to keep track of: the specific experiences of supporting and engaging in DEIJ work and how your thinking has evolved. Sounds like you have a question. I feel like there's a lot to digest, so I'm going to give you a second.
I don't have a question, but I have a challenge that I face with writing these statements. I haven't written and actually submitted that many because as a postdoc, they don't generally require these. But when that time comes, in a lot of STEM, and geology is, I think, a little bit worse than most, there is not a lot of representation of various underrepresented groups, particularly women, because of the field work and things like that. And having written these statements and thought about it and thought about how mentorship and teaching plays into that, I feel like when I write them, there's an elephant in the statement of me, of that at the end of the day, if I am interviewing against or, along with a person who themselves contributes more diversity to the department, which is deeply and sorely needed, there's like almost an asterisk at the end of the statement that says, but if there's a woman competing with me, you should probably just hire her. So I don't, that's something that I have struggled to deal with in these statements.
So I think one of the most successful ways that I have seen people address that idea is allyship. As a man in the department, I will seek out and support women in the department. I will do my best to support, underrepresented minorities. I will do my best to support women. I will do my best to support them. And I will seek out additional resources on campus and within the department to support them in the ways that I cannot. Because there are other resources. You are not the only person in the department, and you're not the only person at a university. Like, we over at the ATL can support people beyond in any department, and a lot of universities have centers for teaching and learning. A lot of graduate schools have faculty in the graduate school that work across departments. And so one of the things to consider in a DEI statement is that you are not personally responsible for all of the DEIJ at an institution. You can support individuals through mentorship. You can also support the objectives at the university through the mission, and their mission statements on everybody's website of, here's our diversity statement. Support those missions, sit on those committees, support initiatives in order to get more faculty, in order to, do maternity leave, whatever it is that is near and dear to your heart concerning DEI. You can say, I'm not going to identify as this person, but I can be an ally and I can support in initiatives that go to further those, and I can find relationships and establish relationships to support faculty interactions, and then those faculty can also support my students. Does that help?
Yes.
Yeah.
So.
All of these are the same suggestions. On the other side, though, avoid generic definitions, contextualized to your institution. So I'm not just going to help underrepresented minorities. I'm going to help women in science. Don't use euphemisms. Be explicit about who you are. There is a movement now of including positionality statements. I don't know how widespread it's going to be, but at least in chemistry education research, there's positionality statements that are going into articles. I am a woman in STEM who was raised in the South, working in a private R1 institution. In my identification in those identities, it tells whoever is reading what I have clout to speak about. So don't use euphemisms, just say, here's who I am, and part of your statement can be, I'm going to seek out the resources on campus. And when I can't help, I'm going to try my best to find what I will devote time and energy to doing it. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the time, it's that the DEIJ statements are targeted towards students or supporting individuals who don't know how to find the resources. As a first-gen college student, there are so many things that I did not know about how universities work. Like, having graduated and now working at a university, I still don't understand how they work. So taking the time to say, here's who I am, here are my experiences, here is how I can use my understanding and knowledge of the way things work to support others or to find resources that may not be obvious. And then avoid using a deficit-based approach. So this means using asset-based language. This is the hill that I will die on. Note on language. There's deficit-based language and asset-based language. The deficit-based language or deficit perspective. These students don't know what they're doing. These students need to be fixed. This course needs to be fixed. This program needs to be fixed. People don't need to be fixed. Okay. Examples of this, anything that talks about a gap, achievement gap. This group of students is not doing as well as that group of students because of some inherent deficiency in that group of students. We're not doing that anymore. Okay, we're not calling students at risk. We're not any of these things. We're going to use asset-based language. Emphasizes institutional structures that can change. Okay, so equity gap, education depth, and opportunity gap. We are going to address the success of all students by closing the equity gap. We are going to meet students where they are and support them with the things they need to be supported in. My at-risk students are not at risk. They have experienced an education debt or an opportunity gap. And so I will support those students using things like funds of knowledge and engaging in formative assessment in order to understand what they currently know to build a strong foundation and grow from there.
So a sort of litmus test, to tell the difference between these two groups. A deficit-based statement would focus on the shortcomings in the individual, even if they're credited to some cause. Whereas the asset-based is going to, it still focuses, it sounds like, on shortcomings, but shortcomings in the system or the source or something like that, not the student.
Okay. There is and this will also appear in your teaching philosophy. This is not just in your DEIJ statement, but this is also in your teaching philosophy, and sort of, if you're looking for engagement, how are you going to make sure that everyone's going to be engaged and not, just the ones who volunteer? How are you going to be inclusive of everyone? One of the things that happens here with the literature is there's a framework called funds of knowledge, which comes from educational sociocultural learning theories. And the idea of funds of knowledge is that students, are humans who function in the world, and so they have some grounding or experiences that they can bring into the classroom that frames their understanding of how things work. Okay. in equity and DEIJ statements, you can address a lot of comments or a lot of thoughts about assumptions. So one of the more famous assumptions that can be addressed in deficit versus asset-based language is native English speakers versus non-native English speakers. English as a second language or non-native English speakers sometimes are represented as at risk. But the things that we can do to enhance the success of those students is saying they understand, multiple languages. Let's give it to them in multiple languages. Or if we change the formatting, there's a really cool paper that just came out that said, that showed if you change the formatting of the question, you don't change the content of the question, you don't change what's in it or what it's asking or the difficulty, just change the formatting. Everybody increases in their success on those exams, especially the students who are not native English speakers, because it's the way that different languages process information, the spacing. It can help all students in your classroom perform better because you're not clouding the intention of the question. So you can say, our students come into the classroom with many different ways of thinking and knowing. If we can tap into that, then we can actually broaden and help everyone understand, because there are multiple representations when you do that. I feel like I have thrown a lot at you. This was where I was going to workshop. So in your teaching statement, if you have it, the first one, anytime, check for typos and complete sentences. You're going to do some sort of introduction. Here's who I am. Here's some kind of hook to get you interested. I haven't actually sat on a search committee, but I would imagine that there are lots and lots and lots of applications coming in. So catch them somehow in an introduction. Make sure that your philosophy is situated in the university's mission. If your department that you're applying to, you pull up the mission and it's evidence-based practices every third word, maybe talk about that. There is a balance to strike between my philosophy as an instructor and what is expected out of an institution. So we all know that you change your cover letter. You should also change your teaching statement and DEI statement. I recommend having a teaching statement and DEI statement for each type of institution that you are applying to. So community colleges versus R2 or master's institutions versus R1, private versus public, or if you're going into a research focused place. So whatever, broad classification of institution, you should have a teaching statement for each one of those. And then within each application, if you're teaching intro, talk about intro classes. If they want someone who's teaching grad classes, talk about grad classes. Look up course codes. Almost every university has the specific course codes listed. You can pull up the schedule of classes, you can pull up the course catalog, and you can say, I want to teach chemistry 1307. I like teaching 300 people classes. I want to exclusively teach classes that are under 20 class. So go find a course catalog that's capped at 20. And then you can get into all of the things that we've talked about already about classroom environment and curricular choices, those types of things. DEI statement, show your positionality, show your personal experiences. I talk about being bullied in my DEI statement. I talk about being the only woman in my master's program. I talk about inauguration day. Like I put it on the table who I am and why I have unique experiences that my students will benefit from, and that I'm willing to create those relationships with my students. There's a whole bunch of resources. I'll send you these slides. And then I also want to include, I work with the Academy for Teaching and Learning. I do discipline-based education research. We have a wonderful website that has many, many resources. We also do consults. If you are currently teaching, if you plan to teach in the future, if you just have questions, you can email us. I do STEM, we have people in philosophy and history and humanities, all sorts of things. So we will be happy to sit down and work with you one-on-one on any of these documents or application packets. What the literature says, we can, do a crash course and hear sort of the top 10 words and ideas that might be pertinent. But we're always happy and available to do consults or work with you on any type capacity like that.